Hello and welcome to the dungeon. I'm your host Rob, and today we're going to be doing part 4 of our look at Warlock spells. It's almost unbelievable that I thought I could ever do this all in one video. The video would have been like 2 hours long, it would have been very boring, and you would have had to look at my face for 2 hours, and nobody should have to go through that. So I think overall it worked out for the best because now we've got a bunch of smaller videos. It's a lot easier to navigate and find what you might be looking for. So today we're going to be looking at the last 3 archetypes from the main series of books. We have the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide, and then we've got 2 from Xanatar's. So that's going to be today's video, and we're just going to be looking at the packed spells, just like we did in the other ones, and we'll just go through all the different choices. So if we look at the Pact of the Undying, to me this one's, it's not that it's a bad list. It has some pretty good spells on it. But there's some spells that just really make me scratch my head. So starting at level 1, we have False Life and Ray of Sickness. And False Life is something we can already get as an invocation, and we can cast it at will without using a spell slot. Now, sure, the spell does scale somewhat decently, but if you look at the spell, what we're really getting is D4 plus 4 temporary hit points, and an additional 5 temporary hit points per level of the spell. Now, temporary hit points aren't a bad thing, but if I'm going to be using a spell slot on this, I could just be casting Armor of Agathis, which is going to give me almost as many hit points, like literally within, between 0 and 3 hit point difference. So almost as many hit points, and it's going to be giving me the damage reflection on top of that. And to me, that's just a way better deal. And that's not to say that the invocation is bad, because the fact that you can just give yourself essentially 8 temporary hit points, essentially at will, because let's face it, you can just keep recasting it over and over again if you're not in combat until you roll a 4 on your D4. Not that hard to do. So with the invocation, you basically just have extra 8 temporary hit points going into every single encounter, and that is awesome. Why wouldn't you just rather do that? And yes, it costs an invocation, but to me, that's a way cheaper price to pay than having to use one of my spell slots and having to, cast this, getting like D4 plus 4 temporary hit points. What if I roll 1? Now I have 5 extra hit points. Literally, Armor of Agathis would have done the same thing, but better. So I just feel like it's just not a good spell choice at all, and especially not good for Warlocks. It's not that it's bad in other classes, but we have other spells like Armor of Agathis that vastly outshine it, in my opinion. And we can get the same effect from an invocation. Now, the invocation does not level up with us. It's just always going to be those 8 temporary hit points. But I'm okay with that because I'm probably not going to be still casting this spell when I'm like level 15 or something. And I'm not going to have the invocation by then either. I'm going to trade it out for something different. But an extra 8 temporary hit points when I'm like level 1 or 2 or 3 is a huge difference. And that can be easily the difference between life and death. So it is an excellent invocation if I'm going to be up front and getting hit a lot. And even if I just want to be ranged and I'm just like, hey, you know what? I just want an extra 8 hit points so I don't have to worry about going down. I think that's solid. It's not good if I'm using one of my only spell slots per short rest on this spell that's, just worse than Armor of Agathis in almost every possible way. So, like I said, if you want the ability, just take it from the invocation. I just don't think it's worth the spell slot. Ray of Sickness was our other one. And this is actually, I don't know, I've got mixed feelings on this one, because as a single target damage spell, 2.8 damage isn't bad. The problem is they do get a saving throw, and it's a Constitution saving throw, and it's poison damage. However, the saving throw isn't for half damage. It's to avoid the poisoned condition, which in my opinion is much better. It also scales fairly well because it goes up by an extra D8 per spell level, as opposed to like a D6 is what, a lot of the other spells are. So the damage is slightly higher. The saving throw isn't for half damage. They still take the full damage regardless. They just avoid the poison condition. But poison is a pretty good condition to give something. So I actually feel like it's a pretty decent spell. It's just there's a lot of things that are immune to poison, so beware of that. And it is a Constitution save, so probably don't be hitting things that you know are going to have a really, really high con save. But other than that, for a single target damage spell, it's not a bad choice. And like I say, the poison condition is really powerful. So there is that. Level 2, we get blindness, deafness. We talked about this in the last video. And we get silence. So these are both pretty excellent spells. I like blindness, deafness a lot. It's a debuff with no concentration. And silence is quite excellent. Now, again, neither of these, well, especially silence does not scale. But, you know, it's one you can take as your level 2 spell and then trade it out later. Nothing wrong with that. And blindness, deafness, like I said, concentration-free debuffs are pretty rare in this game. Level 3 spells, we get Feigning Death and Speak with Dead. Now, Feigning Death, I always like this for like roleplay type stuff, but the truth is, it's just not a very good spell. It's very, very niche and very limited. Now, if you're going to be trying to pull some, you know, Ocean's 11 style caper, then Feigning Death might be kind of fun. But the truth is, if you're just trying to smuggle some guy out of the castle, you probably could have just used Dimension Door or Arcane Gate or Teleport or any of 100 other choices. Unlike Ocean's 11, we actually have access to magic. So that gives us a lot more options. And yeah, some of those options are a lot higher level, but I don't know that I really want to use a level 3 spell slot on Feigning Death. You know, I could be using Counterspell or Hypnotic Pattern, something that I'm going to be using a lot. But like I said, it is a cool effect and it is neat for roleplay stuff, so I don't want to be too hard on it. It's just super niche. Speak with Dead. Now, Speak with Dead is an excellent spell, and it's especially good in like roleplay heavy investigation type campaigns. But there is a problem here, which is that we also could have taken an invocation that gives us Speak with Dead at will. Now, we don't actually get that until level 9, so, you know, I think that taking this at level 5 and then maybe trading it out later isn't necessarily a bad option. Speak with Dead also, it's unlike False Life, where you could just be casting that as an invocation at will and having that ready for every combat. You're probably not going to be casting Speak with Dead at will. And even if you have a dead body you wanted to interrogate, you can only actually use the spell on one particular body once every 10 days. So I feel like this justifies using a spell slot more than False Life would, for example. But even still, it is not really scaling. It is something we can get with an invocation. You know, it's not terrible, but it's not great. Level 4, Aura of Life and Death Ward. These are both actually pretty good spells. Aura of Life, I feel, is kind of a weird choice for the spell list, but I mean, it does give everybody within range of you, like I think it's 30-foot radius, resistance to necrotic damage, and it makes you immune to things that would decrease your maximum hit point totals. So certain types of undead, especially, and even a few like fiends, but most undead will drain your hit point maximum sometimes. So against those types of things, a lot of specters and whatnot, then it's an excellent spell. It is a level 4 spell, so it is pretty high level to be using against that stuff. But, you know, it's really good under those circumstances. I feel like Death Ward is actually just an excellent spell in general. It's a nice like cast on somebody and kind of forget about it type of buff. And it's particularly good if you are going to go to the front line a lot and maybe getting rendered unconscious, you know? Or you can cast it on like the cleric if he doesn't want to cast it on himself, you know? So overall, pretty good. And like I said, there is a bit of scaling issue, but they're not the worst, either one. Level 5, you get Contagion and Legend Lore. Contagion is a very nice spell. I like it a lot. Legend Lore is very niche as well, kind of fitting into that like Speak with Dead category, where you might be using it for roleplay purposes, in which case it's a good spell. And a lot of times adventure hooks will be like, oh, your party's heard about something or some specific artifact, and this is a nice way to research those kind of things. But how often is that going to come up? I don't know. But, you know, having it on the spell list and then just, you know, using it a few times in a campaign, when it's useful, it's extremely useful. It's just those circumstances tend to be pretty rare. So let's move on to the Celestial and the Hexblade from Xanatar's. The Celestial, I'm really kind of confused by this spell list because it's like a strange combination of like fire damage and cleric type abilities, but you know, maybe it's like that avenging angel type of thing, who knows. But it's not a bad spell list. I'm just confused by the theme here. You know, it's like healing people and burning people to death. The Fiend, that makes sense for burning people to death, you know, but as the Celestial, it's a little less clear. But either way, it is a pretty good spell list. Level 1, we get Cure Wounds and Guiding Bolt. Cure Wounds scales quite nicely, so nothing wrong with that necessarily. And Guiding Bolt is actually, this is one where, I mean, the damage does scale, so it's not the worst thing in the world. I do find that it's not necessarily as good as you level up, but it does have that nice rider where you give the person after you gets advantage on their next attack. So circumstantially it can be really good. Like if you know that there's a paladin or a rogue or somebody coming after you in the initiative order, and you want to just give them, hey, now you got advantage, you got double chances of getting that crit, you know, go crazy kind of thing, then it can be really good. I find that it's better at low level where the damage is still very high compared to monster hit points, and where pretty much anybody's going to be able to benefit from advantage. But as you level up, a lot of people just really don't, you know, like the fighter who's making a couple attacks around but is only hitting for 7 or 8 damage per hit. Sure, getting advantage might be nice, and maybe now he gets a crit and he gets to do an extra, you know, 1 dice of damage or whatever. But it's way better on that paladin or the rogue. The problem is that now you're really kind of limited by the initiative order, so I find it's a kind of a hard spell to really get the most out of it. But at low levels, it doesn't really matter as much, you know? The rogue's only doing like 1 die 6 sneak damage anyway, so, you know, if the fighter ends up getting advantage, that's fine. Level 2, you get Flaming Sphere and Lesser Restoration. Flaming Sphere is one of these like area type damage persistent spells, except you can actually move the area, which can be pretty nice sometimes. So there is that. Lesser Restoration. And Lesser Restoration is just one of those kind of spells that somebody in the party needs, and hopefully that's not you. Hopefully there's a cleric or somebody. But if there's not, you know, then someone probably has to take it. Level 3, Daylight and Revivify. Daylight's very nice if you can be fighting things like Drow or certain types of undead, in which case that is an amazing spell. But if you're not going to be in the Underdark a lot, and you're not going to be fighting those types of undead, then take Hypnotic Pattern instead or something, you know? But that's okay. I mean, it's a niche spell, but, you know, if you're doing like a, you know, Underdark style campaign, then you're going to be able to use that spell a lot, in which case it makes a great choice. And if you're not, then, you know, you just kind of know that. You're like, yeah, I don't really need it. Revivify, this falls into the same category as Cure Wounds and Lesser Restoration. It's an excellent spell. I just don't know that I want to be the one using it. You know, I don't have a lot of spell slots. So hopefully we have a cleric or somebody who can cast Revivify. But hey, maybe he's a war cleric and he just keeps charging into battle. And this is why we needed me as a backup. Now I have to Cure Wounds our war cleric and revive him. Maybe he got himself killed and now I have to revivify him. And it does kind of suck that I only have 2 spell slots per short rest. And now I have to save one of them to keep resurrecting our war cleric who keeps dying. But, you know, better that than having a dead war cleric, I suppose. Level 4, Guardian of Faith and Wall of Fire. Guardian of Faith is actually a pretty nice spell. The problem is the Guardian doesn't really move much. So if you're able to fight in a controlled area of the battlefield, it's an excellent spell. Wall of Fire we talked about in the last video, so I won't go into a lot of detail. But again, these persistent AoEs, which are really nice on Warlocks, because things like Repelling Blast and Grasp of Hadar allow us to kind of like get a lot more mileage out of these spells. You know, if a wizard casts Wall of Fire and somebody charges through, that's kind of it for the Wall of Fire. Did some damage, you know, that's about it. But with you, you're like, no, I'm going to Repelling Blast them back on the other side again. And now we're obscured, so it's hard for them to even hit us. And now he's going to have to come through the wall again in order to attack us. and you just get so much more mileage out of it. Level 5, Flame Strike and Greater Restoration. I mentioned Flame Strike last video as well. I'm not really a fan, but I do feel like it's a thematic spell for this spell list, so I'm not going to be too hard on it. You know, it kind of combined that Radiant and Fire Holy type stuff all together in one. It's just not very good at it, that's all. But unlike the Pact of the Fiend, you don't have Fireball on your spell list, so there's maybe a little more incentive to take it. The Fiend is just completely outclassed by Fireball. And then you have Greater Restoration. Again, it's a great spell. I just don't know that I want to be the one casting it all the time. But, you know, it is good. And one thing that's nice about the Celestial Pact is that you can kind of fit that, like, damage dealer / healer type of role in the party. And, you know, maybe you don't need a lot of healing in your party. Maybe you've got, like, you and a paladin, for example, and you're like, yeah, we don't really have a dedicated healer, so we're going to have to each pick up some of those type of spells, but between the two of us, we're probably going to be okay. And, you know, nothing wrong with that. And the Hexblade. Level 1, Shield and Wrathful Smite. Like I've said many times before, Shield is it is sweltering hot here, by the way. I'm in Canada. We don't get a lot of sweltering heat, but today is clearly one of those days. Shield and Wrathful Smite, like I said, Shield is a great level 1 spell. It does not scale at all, and I feel like it's kind of a trap in a lot of cases. But you can take it and then trade it out later. Or, my preferred method, if your campaign allows multi-classing, combine with a different class that has level 1 spell slots, cast Smite or cast Shield with your level 1 spell slots from your other class, and, you know, profit. Wrathful Smite, I'm not a big fan of a lot of the Smite spells, mostly because they require concentration, and it's just competing with my concentration slots. And honestly, I could just be like dropping those spell slots on Eldritch Smites and doing pretty much the same or even more damage without needing concentration. And if I miss, I don't have to use the spell slot or anything like that. And then I can still maintain concentration on other spells that I might want. So I don't really like the spells a lot, but that being said, sometimes you just need to do a lot of damage in one round to one target in a hurry, and Hex isn't really the best for that. It's just an extra d6 added to those attacks. Sometimes you just want to just crush something for a truckload of damage. And there is some scaling on these spells, so I don't think that there's no place for them. I just think that a lot of times, especially as we level up, we just start getting way better options. But at level 1, Wrathful Smite isn't the worst thing that you could be casting, so, you know, there is that. Level 2, Blur and Branding Smite. Branding Smite kind of falls into the same category as all the rest of the Smites. Not a lot of need to talk about it. Blur, I've mentioned before, I generally prefer Mirror Image, but it's not that Blur is a bad spell. Mirror Image doesn't require concentration, that's why I kind of like it better. But Blur really starts to shine when you have high armor class. So if you're a Hexblade, let's say you just went straight Hexblade, no multi-classing, but you could still be wearing something like medium armor, maybe even some half plate eventually, using a shield maybe. I mean, you could easily have like 18 to 20 armor class once you start getting some magic items. And Blur is just going to make you really hard to hit. Hitting 20 armor class with disadvantage is very, very difficult. Level 3, Blink and Elemental Weapon. Blink kind of falls in the same category as Blur in some ways. It doesn't scale with your armor class, but it's just, you know, that really good defensive spell that makes you hard to hit. And, you know, Blink's pretty good for that. Elemental Weapon is very nice, especially at 3rd level, or as a 3rd level spell, sorry, because now we're 5th level, and we also have access to the Thirsting Blade invocation. So if you're making a couple attacks around, Elemental Weapon can help add some damage. If you happen to know something has certain vulnerabilities, then you can take advantage of that. So Elemental Weapon is a pretty good spell overall, I think. Level 4, Phantasmal Killer and Staggering Smite. Phantasmal Killer is a terrible spell. I mentioned this in the last video. If you read it, They get a saving throw when you cast it on them. They don't take any damage though. They get a saving throw. On their turn, they get another saving throw. If they fail that, they then take the damage. So they get 2 saving throws to avoid taking any damage at all. It's just not very good in my opinion, especially as a 4th level spell. And you got so many other options that you can be casting at this level. So, staggering Smite. I mean, it's not the worst Smite spell, you know, but again, it's a level 4 spell. It's requiring a concentration, and you could just be using that as an Elder Smite, and then you don't have to worry about concentration. And then if you just want to do a bunch of damage, you can just do that instead, in my opinion. Level 5, Banishing Smite and Cone of Cold. Now, Banishing Smite does depart from the rest because it is a crowd control plus a Smite all rolled into one. And, you know, Banishment was going to require concentration if you use that. Banishing Smite having concentration isn't a big deal to me. The only problem with it is that sometimes you just don't want to banish something. You know, maybe you just want to kill it and get its treasure. Because, you know, that's a time-honored tradition of many adventurers all through the years. Or maybe you just didn't know how many hit points it has left. You're just kind of guessing, and it ended up not banishing anything. But overall, I do think it's a pretty decent spell. So of the Smites, it's by far my favorite, at least for the Hexblade. Cone of Cold is also quite excellent, especially if you're like a melee style Hexblade. And you don't have to be as a Hexblade, by the way. You know, Hexblade gives you the Cursed Spectre. You can kind of use that stable of pets type archetype. You could take the Hexblade Patron and go back to the chain. You know, there's no reason you have to go back to the blade. Now, that is probably the most common combination for the Hexblade, but it's by no means the only way to play the class. But if you are up in the front line, Cone of Cold ends up being a pretty nice spell. It's a lot easier to aim it when you're at the front of the party than when you're at the back. You don't have to try to, you know, worry about hitting all your frontline types if you're up in the front line yourself. You know, so now this may seem obvious to some of you, like obviously you're not going to cast Cone of Cold and hit all your own party members. But you haven't played with some of the people I've played with over the years then, if that's your opinion, because I've been in some parties where players take a certain kind of sick delight in hitting their own party members with AoE spells. So, you know, just be aware that that does happen sometimes. But overall, I think Cone of Cold was an excellent spell, and you know, it's some pretty good damage. The fact that it's cold can be kind of advantageous in certain types of encounters. By no means the worst thing you could have ever taken. So that wraps up our video series for Warlock spells. I need to take a look at some of the other books, because I think there's actually some more Warlock patrons available in some of the other books as well. But if so, we'll get back to that at some future date. I don't really want to worry about it right now. But anyways, that's Warlocks. So leave your thoughts and comments in the comment section. As always, I always tell people those are my favorite things. And feel free to like, subscribe, ring the bell, all that kind of stuff. You know the drill. It's not like this is the first time you've ever used YouTube. And if it is, then welcome to YouTube, but I'm surprised that you would have found my video first. Anyways, that's everything. I'll see you next time in the dungeon. Bye.